Hey guys, tonight we're taking a little trip. Not to a sleepy town or a forgotten forest, but to a time and place that you probably think you know ancient Greece. We're going to walk the sun-baked streets of Athens, breathe in the air, and peek behind the curtains of a world that gave us democracy, philosophy, and some truly questionable plumbing. But forget the sanitized, marble-white version you see in museums. Tonight, we're diving into the messy, complicated, and frankly bizarre reality of their private lives. You'll quickly find that the rules of attraction, love, and power are so alien. You might not survive the first day without committing a major social foul. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support is what keeps these late-night journeys going. Go ahead and drop a comment below telling me what city you're listening from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background tone. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the feeling of stepping off a wooden ship. The air doesn't smell of clean sea salt. It's thick, a mix of charcoal smoked from countless workshops, roasting meat from a nearby stall, the unmistakable tang of olive oil that seems to coat everything, and a less pleasant, more organic smell of a city with a few 100,000 people and a sanitation system that's, well, a work in progress. This is your arrival in Piraeus, the port of Athens. You make your way toward the city proper. The road is dusty, uneven, and crowded. Donkeys laden with clay pots jostle past you. Merchants shout their prices, and the great queue irrisant the calm, measured tone of a philosopher, but the rapid-fire chatter of everyday life. As you get closer, you see it the Acropolis, perched high on its rock, the Parthenon gleaming under the Aegean sun. It's breathtaking. But here's your first reality check. Forget the pristine, white marble image we have today. In its time, the Parthenon and all the statues around it were painted in what we might consider gaudy colors. Bright reds, blues, and golds covered every surface. It was a spectacle of vibrant, almost aggressive, color. This is a great metaphor for our journey tonight. The history we've inherited is often a faded, bleached version of a much more colorful and complicated reality. You are now in the Agora, the central marketplace and heart of the city. This is where business is done, politics are debated, and gossip is traded like currency. Men in draped tunics, called chitons, gather in shaded colonnades, arguing passionately about law, war, and the price of grain. You see Socrates himself, maybe, looking a bit disheveled, engaging a young, wealthy aristocrat in a conversation that will probably end with the young man being very confused and annoyed. But as you look around, you start to notice something, or rather, the absence of something. Where are the women? You see a few, perhaps, hurrying through the square, their heads covered, their eyes downcast, often accompanied by a male relative or a slave. But they aren't lingering. They aren't participating in the debates. They aren't a public part of this vibrant scene. They are ghosts in their own city. This is your first clue that the social architecture of this place is built on foundations you do not recognize. Let's pause here and absorb the atmosphere. The mainstream history point is obvious. You're standing in the birthplace of Western civilization. Democracy, trial by jury, theatrical drama. It all started right here. But for a little known fact, consider the noise. Historians and acousticians have tried to recreate the sound of the ancient agora, and their findings suggest it was an overwhelming cacophony. The acoustics of the open minus air market, combined with stone surfaces and constant activity, meant that to be heard, you had to shout. The calm, philosophical dialogues we imagined probably took place in much quieter, private settings. The public square was a place of noise and frantic energy. And here's where we touch upon our first academic debate. The very nature of Athenian democracy is a point of constant discussion. Who was actually included only adult, male citizens who had completed their military training, women, slaves, and foreigners, who together made up the vast majority of the population, had no say. So when we hear Athenian democracy, historians are still debating whether to call it a pioneering system of popular rule or a highly exclusive men's club. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across the market, you realize the real Greece isn't in the temples on the hill. It's down here, in the unspoken rules, the glances, the power dynamics playing out between a master and his slave, a husband and his barely seen wife, a citizen and a foreigner. The most important laws here aren't carved into stone. They're woven into the very fabric of society. And to understand what life, love, and intimacy were really like here, you first have to unlearn everything you think you know. So, let's begin that process of unlearning. Before you say a word, before you even make eye contact with someone in this fading light, you need to be reprogrammed. You have to understand the single most important rule governing all relationships in this world. And it has almost nothing to do with the concepts we obsess over today. Forget heterosexuality, homosexuality, bisexuality. Those labels are useless here. They are modern inventions, boxes that an ancient Greek would find baffling. For them, the world of desire wasn't organized by the gender of your partner. It was organized by your role. The most crucial distinction, the one that determined your honor, your social standing, and your very identity as a man, was the dichotomy between being the active partner and the passive one. The penetrator and the penetrated. That's it. That's the entire game. To be the active partner, the one who penetrates, was to be masculine, dominant, and in control. It affirmed your status as a citizen, a man of substance and power. It was seen as natural, an expression of a man's rightful place in the hierarchy of the world. You could be the active partner with your wife, with a female slave, with a prostitute, or even with a boy or another man under very specific circumstances we'll get to later. And your masculinity would remain perfectly intact. In fact, it would be enhanced. You were exercising your will upon the world. But to be the passive partner, to be penetrated, was a different story entirely. If you were an adult male citizen, this was socially catastrophic. It meant you were taking the role of a woman, a slave, a foreigner, or a child, someone who is, by nature, subservient anchored. It stripped you of your masculine honor. It suggested you lacked self-control, that you were effeminate and submissive. This wasn't a private preference. It was a public disgrace that could have real world consequences. Here's a specific piece of knowledge to tuck away if a man was widely believed to enjoy the passive role. He could be labeled a kina eidos. This was one of the most vicious insults imaginable. It wasn't just name-calling. A man accused of being a kina eidos could, in some cases, be legally barred from speaking in the public assembly, from serving as a magistrate, or from bringing charges in court. Why, the logic was, if you cannot govern your own body and its desires, how can you possibly be trusted to govern the city? Your lack of self-mastery in private life was seen as proof of your unfit for public life. Your identity was a performance. and you had just failed on the most public stage of all. So, as you stand there in the cooling evening air, you realize that your masculinity here isn't a given. It's a fragile construct that must be constantly guarded. Every interaction is a potential test. You're not worried about who you're attracted to. You're worried about how that attraction is perceived and, more importantly, acted upon. This brings us to one of the most enduring debates among historians of this period. Where did this incredibly rigid active-passive fixation come from? It's not a universal human constant. So what made it so central to Greek culture? One major theory points to the military. Greek society, especially in places like Sparta but also in Athens, was a warrior culture. The world was seen through the lens of conqueror and conquered, dominant and submissive. This mindset, so essential on the battlefield, may have bled into every other aspect of life, including the most intimate. A man acts, a man takes, a man conquers. Another school of thought, however, argues that the root lies more in the structure of the Greek household. The oikos, the male head of the household, the kyrios, held absolute legal and social power over everyone living under his roof: his wife, his children, and his slaves. His role was to command and control. Their role was to obey. This domestic power dynamic, some historians argue, created the template for all other relationships. A citizen minus man was a kyrios in the world, and to willingly take the passive role was to abdicate that God minus given authority. Scholars are still trying to untangle whether this was a military ethos shaping the home or a domestic ethos shaping the state. Whatever its origin, the rule is absolute, and it's your new reality. The world around you is not divided into straight and gay. It's divided into those who act and those who are acted upon. It's a brutal, simple, and all-minus encompassing system of power. Understanding this is your first and most vital step to surviving in ancient Athens. It's the key that unlocks everything else we're about to see, from the lives of husbands and wives to the city's most scandalous affairs. You're no longer in a world of equals. You're in a hierarchy, and your position in it is everything. With this fundamental rule, the active-passive dichotomy, firmly lodged in your mind, let's explore how it plays out. Think of it less as a rulebook and more as the physics of this new universe. It governs the motion of everything. Your role isn't just about what happens in private. It's a public declaration of your status, your power, and your honor. Let's put you in a scenario. You are walking through a quieter, residential street. The houses are modest, windowless walls facing the street, their life turned inward. You pass two men talking. One is older, well minus dressed, with a beard that signifies he's over 30 and a full citizen. The other is younger, maybe in his late teens, smooth, minus, cheeked and athletic. The older man has his hand on the younger man's shoulder. It's a gesture that could be paternal, or it could be something else. No one bats an eye. The older man is clearly the dominant figure here, the potential active partner. His masculinity is not in question. Now, imagine a different scene. You see two men of the same age, both full minus, bearded citizens, walking in a similar way. One is leading on the other, perhaps laughing a little too loudly, his gestures a bit too soft. Immediately, you'd feel the social temperature drop. Eyebrows would be raised. Whispers would follow. Why? Because here, the power dynamic is ambiguous. Who is dominant if they are peers? Then one of them might be willingly taking on a submissive, passive role, and that is a public scandal. It's a violation of the unspoken code of citizen conduct. It's not about love. It's about a perceived abdication of masculine authority. This obsession with role extended to every corner of society. Let's talk about the mainstream historical point, the visual culture. Greek art, especially the decorations on pottery used for everyday life and special occasions, like the Symposium, the all-male drinking party, is shockingly explicit. You can find countless vases showing intimate scenes. And what you see, over and over again, is a clear depiction of this active, passive dynamic. The figures are carefully drawn to show who is in the dominant role. The penetrator is almost always depicted as a mature, bearded male, the ideal citizen. The penetrated partner is a woman, or a beardless youth, or someone who is clearly not a social equal. The art served as a constant visual reinforcement of the social code. This is acceptable. This is the natural order of things. But here's a weirder, more specific detail that shows how deep this went. The Greeks had a whole vocabulary of insults related to the body that were designed to attack a man's honor by suggesting he was passive. One of the strangest insults was to call a man a Europroctos, which literally means wide minus arse. It was a crude but effective way to imply that he was habitually penetrated. It wasn't a comment on his physical appearance so much as a direct assault on his social standing. Speeches from Athenian court cases are filled with this kind of language. An opponent in a lawsuit wouldn't just be called a liar or a thief. He'd be called effeminate, a kiner eidos, a Euryproctos. All attempts to disqualify him as a credible, honorable man in the eyes of the jury. This leads us to another fascinating area of academic debate. Was this all just talk, or did these accusations have real world bite? On one hand, we have the laws, like the one we mentioned, that could bar a passive man from public speaking. This suggests the threat was very real. Some historians argue that these laws were actively enforced and that a man's reputation for passivity could genuinely ruin his life and career. They point to the sheer volume of these insults in legal and comedic texts as evidence that this was a constant, pressing anxiety for Athenian men. On the other hand, some scholars take a more skeptical view. They suggest that these insults were more like rhetorical weapons than legal tools. Think of it like a modern politician calling their rival soft on crime. It's a powerful accusation meant to sway public opinion, but it's not a formal legal charge. These historians argue that while the idea of the passive man was shameful, proving it in court was nearly impossible. There are very few surviving records of anyone actually being convicted and punished under these laws. The debate, therefore, is about whether this was a system of genuine legal persecution or a system of social control managed through shame, gossip, and insult. Was it the letter of the law that mattered, or the fear of public humiliation? So as you navigate this world, you start to understand. It's a performance. Your masculinity is a costume you wear every day, and you must never be seen adjusting it in the wrong way. The power you hold as a man is not inherent. It's relational. It only exists in its expression over others. Women, slaves, non-minus citizens, and youths. The game is not about who you desire, but about how you demonstrate that desire. It must always be from a position of power, and the moment you are perceived as the one submitting to another man's desire, you risk losing everything. This is the tightrope every single Athenian citizen minus male had to walk, every single day. Now that you've grasped the fundamental physics of this world, the all minus important active-passive dynamic, let's talk about what's at stake. It's not just about avoiding insults in the marketplace. It's about protecting your dignity, or, to use the Greek concept, your time. Time is a word that means order, public esteem, and the respect you are due because of your status. For an adult male citizen, his time was his most valuable possession. more precious than his land or his olive groves. And being cast in the passive role was a direct assault on it. Let's break down why this was so devastating. The core of a citizen's identity was his autonomy, his ability to be self-governing. This was the philosophical underpinning of democracy itself. The city minus state. The polis was a body of free men who governed themselves, and each citizen was a microcosm of that ideal. He was expected to be the master of his own desires, his own emotions, and his own household. This self-mastery self-rosy knee was the hallmark of a good man. To willingly be penetrated was to demonstrate a catastrophic lack of self-mastery. It signaled that you were ruled by pleasure, that you couldn't control your own body. You were acting like a woman, who the Greeks believed was naturally more emotional and less rational, or a slave, who was by definition not in control of their own body. You were, in essence, failing at the primary task of being a man. This wasn't a private moral failing. It was a public abdication of your very qualification to be a citizen. If you couldn't rule yourself, you certainly couldn't be trusted with a vote on whether to go to war with Sparta. This is a central historical point. The link between personal conduct and political privilege was absolute. We can see this explicitly in the writings of orators like Aeschylus. In his famous speech against Timarchus, he prosecutes his political rival, Timarchus, not for corruption or treason in the way we'd expect, but for his alleged past. Aeschylus accuses Timarchus of having prostituted himself to other men when he was a youth. The legal argument is stunningly direct. The law, Aeschylus argues, forbids a man who has sold his body from addressing the people. By allowing himself to be used passively for money, Timarchus has forfeited his right to participate in the democratic process. He has, in a sense, citizened himself through his actions. Now for a more peculiar and specific illustration of this honor system. The fear of being passively victimized was so intense that Athenian law had some surprising provisions for it. Let's say a man broke into your house. If he was there to steal your silver, you could prosecute him for theft. But if you caught a man in the act of seducing or assaulting your wife, your daughter, or even a male youth under your protection, the law gave you the right to kill him on the spot. This was considered justifiable homicide. Why the extreme difference? Because the second man wasn't just stealing property. He was committing an act of hubris against you. He was violating your honor, trespassing on your domain, and symbolically penetrating your household. He was challenging your masculine authority and your time. The law recognized this as an offense so grave that it warranted immediate, lethal retribution. It shows how profoundly this culture viewed sexual transgression not as a sin, but as an act of aggression and a violation of a man's honor. This brings us to a complex scholarly debate that is still very much alive. Was the stigma attached to the passive role primarily about effemination? Or was it about status? The traditional view holds that it was about gender roles. To be passive was to be woman minus light. And in a deeply patriarchal society, that was the ultimate degradation for a man. This view is supported by a lot of the language used in insults, which often compares passive men to women. However, a more recent and nuanced argument, championed by scholars like David Halper and the late Michel Foucault, suggests that the primary axis of shame wasn't gender, but social hierarchy and power. They argue that the core issue was not about being like a woman, but about being like a slave, submitting to the will of another. The real crime was the surrender of autonomy for a freeborn citizen, whose entire identity was based on being free and in command. To willingly enter a state of submission was the ultimate paradox. This theory helps explain why it was perfectly acceptable for a master to have a passive relationship with his own slave. The existing power dynamic of master-slave was simply being reaffirmed. The shame was not in the act itself, but in who was doing it to whom. The debate continues, trying to determine whether the insult you're acting like a woman was the root of the problem, or if you're acting like a slave was the deeper, more terrifying accusation. So, as a citizen, you guard your time with your life. You project an aura of self-control and authority at all times. You understand that the gaze of your peers is a constant tribunal, and any perceived lapse in your masculine performance can lead to social ruin. It's a high-warrior act, performed over a canyon of public shame. This pressure to maintain one's dignity, to constantly perform the role of the dominant male, is the engine that drives so much of the behavior we'll see next. As we step into the shoes of an Athenian man and see what his world really looks like. Alright, let's make this personal. For this part of our journey, you are no longer just an observer. You are now a full-fledged Athenian citizen. Let's call you Damon. You're about 35 years old. The beard you've been carefully grooming for the last 15 years is full and respectable. You own a decent plot of land just outside the city walls, inherited from your father, where you grow olives and grain. You have a wife and two small children, a son and a daughter, tucked away in the back of your modest city house. You've completed your mandatory military service, years ago, and you have the right to vote in the assembly. By all measures, you are the backbone of the Athenian state. Your day starts early. With the sun, there's no gentle alarm clock, just the sounds of the city stirring to life. You eat a simple breakfast, some barley bread dipped in wine, maybe a few figs. Then you're out the door. Your wife remains behind. In the Guinea icon, the women's quarters at the back of the house, you might not see her again until the evening meal. If at all, her world is inside. Yours is outside. Your first stop is the Agora. This is the center of your universe. Here, you're not just shopping for fish or olive oil. You're participating in the life of the polis. You meet friends and business associates. You stand in the shade of the Stopi Oikile, the painted colonnade, and you talk. You talk about everything: the ongoing war with Sparta, the latest play by Sophocles, a recent lawsuit that has everyone buzzing, and, of course, politics. You might listen to an orator practicing his speech for the next assembly meeting, judging his arguments and his delivery. This is your right and your duty as a citizen. This is where your public life happens. The key historical fact to absorb here is the sheer amount of leisure time, from which we get our word school, that was available to a citizen like you. This leisure was not seen as idleness. It was the prerequisite for a political life. You didn't have a 9- to -5 job in the modern sense. The hard manual labor on your farm was done by a handful of slaves. The weaving of cloth was done by your wife and female slaves. This economic structure, built on the backs of slaves and the confinement of women, is what frees you up to spend your days in the Agora, engaging in politics, philosophy, and civic life. Your freedom is directly dependent on the unfreedom of others. Now for a slightly more bizarre day the minus life detail. Personal hygiene. You don't have a bathroom with running water. Your house has a latrine, which is essentially a pot. For bathing, you might wash with a basin of water at home, but a more common activity would be to go to a public bathish. Here's the weird part: soap didn't exist. The Greek method for getting clean was to rub olive oil all over your body and then use a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape the oil, sweat, and dirt off your skin. It was an abrasive, exfoliating process. The bathhouses were social hubs, another place to chat and do business, all while being slathered in oil and scraped clay. As Damon, you live with a sense of freedom that would be staggering to us. We've already established the core rule: as long as you are the active partner, your private life is largely your own business. Your desires are not policed. Only your role is. This means that after your morning in the agora, you might decide to visit a lover. This lover could be a woman, perhaps a flute girl you met at a recent party, or a more established court saint. Or this lover could be a teenage boy. As long as the relationship fits into the socially acceptable models we will explore later, no one would condemn you for it. The idea of infidelity as a moral failing on the part of the husband simply did not exist. Your marriage was a contract, a duty to the state to produce heirs. Your emotional and physical fulfillment were sought elsewhere, and this was considered perfectly normal. This leads us to a simmering debate among classicists: how free did an Athenian man really feel on one hand? You have this incredible latitude for personal relationships outside of marriage. You are the master of your household and devoter in the assembly. You seem to be on top of the world. This is the traditional, golden age view of Athens. However, many modern historians push back against this, arguing that the life of an Athenian man was actually fraught with anxiety. You are under constant pressure to maintain your honor, your time. You're in a fiercely competitive society. You could be dragged into a lawsuit at any moment by a rival. You are expected to contribute financially to public works, like funding a worship or a theatrical chorus, and failing to do so brings shame. You live in fear of public humiliation. Your performance of masculinity is constantly being judged by your peers. Was this a life of carefree liberty, or a life of intense, paranoid pressure to conform to a rigid code of manly honor? Scholars are divided. Some see a confident, dominant patriarch. Others see a man constantly looking over his shoulder, terrified of being shamed in public. As the afternoon wears on, you might head to the gymnasium, another exclusively male domain. There, you exercise, socialize, and watch the youths train. Later, you may have been invited to a symposium, a drinking party at a friend's house. This is where the real business of the evening begins. Your life as Damon is a whirlwind of public duties, social rituals, and private freedoms, all balanced on the knife's edge of honor. It is a world built for you, and you are its master. But mastery, you are beginning to learn, comes with its own heavy burdens. So, you're Damon, an Athenian citizen, and your day is your own. You've fulfilled your social and political duties in the agora. Now, this is where we delve into the world that exists for you outside the bounds of your marriage. Your relationship with your wife is a matter of household management and procreation. Your relationship with the rest of the world, that's a matter of pleasure, politics, and personal preference. The fundamental historical point here is the starkly compartmentalized nature of a man's life. Love, desire, intellectual companionship, and procreation were not expected to be found in a single relationship, as is the modern ideal. Instead, a Greek man would seek to satisfy these different needs from different sources. For producing a legitimate heir to inherit his property and carry on the family name, he had his wife. For everyday sexual release, he might turn to a female slave in his own household or visit a low-cost prostitute pornee. For intellectual stimulation, witty conversation, and a more refined romantic experience, he might seek the company of a highly educated courtesan, a hetaira. And for a relationship that was seen as both educational and romantic, combining mentorship with desire, he might court an adolescent boy. This wasn't seen as hypocritical or contradictory. It was simply how society was structured. Each type of relationship had its own place, its own rules, and its own purpose. The idea that a man would be unfaithful to his wife by engaging in these other relationships would have been nonsensical. He wasn't breaking any vows, because the vow was not one of exclusive emotional or physical fidelity. The vow was to the oikos, the household. His duty was to provide for his wife and protect her honor, not to love her exclusively. Let's look at one of these options a little more closely and get into the nitty-gritty. The use of household slaves for sexual purposes was an accepted, unremarkable fact of life. As the master of the house, the Kyrios, you held absolute power over the bodies of your slaves, male or female. There was no concept of consent or assault in this context. A slave's body was the property of their master. This is a chilling reality, but it's crucial to understanding the power dynamics of the time. This wasn't a dirty secret. It was an assumed privilege of your position. The famous orator Demosthenes sums up the Athenian male's perspective quite neatly in one of his speeches. We have courtesans for pleasure, concubines for the daily care of the body, and wives for the purpose of producing legitimate children and to be a faithful guardian of our households. Notice the clear, unapologetic segmentation. Here's a more unusual detail that highlights the boundaries of this freedom. While you, daemon, could sleep with one of your own slaves without a second thought, you could get into serious trouble for sleeping with a slave belonging to another man. Why? Because you weren't violating the slave. You were violating the other man's property rights. It was akin to taking his donkey for a joyride without asking. The legal issue was one of property damage, not a moral or sexual transgression. This reinforces the idea that so many of these rules were about the relationships between men and the protection of their property and honor, with women and slaves often being the objects through which these transactions occurred. This reality of a man's world opens up a significant debate among historians. How did Athenian men conceptualize love? The Greek language has several words for love. There's eros, the passionate, often overwhelming desire. There's philia, the deep affection and friendship you might feel for your comrades or family. And there's agape, a more selfless, unconditional love. When a man like Damon looked for love, what was he actually looking for? And where did he expect to find it? One school of thought argues that for the Greeks, true, passionate eros was almost exclusively sought and experienced outside of marriage. Marriage was for philia at best, a kind of domestic friendship and partnership. Eros was considered too volatile, too dangerous, too irrational to be the foundation of a stable household. You indulged your eros with a court saying or a youth, but you built your family on the much calmer, more reliable ground of duty. Another perspective, however, suggests we might be underestimating the potential for affection within marriage, while the initial union was a transaction. Some scholars argue that genuine philia and even a quiet form of eros could develop over time between a husband and wife. They point to funerary inscriptions and some passages in plays that seem to express genuine grief and affection for a deceased spouse. The debate hinges on how we interpret the evidence. Are these expressions of love genuine reflections of personal feeling, or are they just formal conventions? The right thing to say about a wife who has fulfilled her duty were Athenian marriages emotional deserts? Or could they, on occasion, become oases of quiet companionship? The evidence is ambiguous, leaving us to wonder about the hidden emotional lives behind the stone-faced walls of the oikos. So, as evening approaches, you have choices. Your wife is at home, overseeing the preparation of the evening meal, but your night doesn't have to end there. Perhaps you'll meet friends. Perhaps you'll visit someone. The city is your playground, and its complex social rules are designed to accommodate your desires. As long as you play your part correctly, the world outside your marriage is vast and varied, a landscape of possibilities built for men, by men, and tonight, you might have an invitation to the one place where all these elements, pleasure, intellect, and politics, come together in a heady, wine-soaked mix. The Symposium. The sun has finally dipped below the horizon, but the city is still alive with the glow of oil lamps. You received an invitation, and tonight, you're headed to a symposium. Now, the word symposium might make you think of a dry, academic conference. Forget that. The Greek symposium literally means drinking together, and it is the absolute epicenter of elite male social life. It's part dinner party, part philosophical salon, and part rowdy frat party, all rolled into one. You arrive at the house of your host, a wealthy friend. You're not led into a grand dining hall. Instead, you're shown into the andron, the men's quarters, a room specifically designed for this purpose. The layout is key. Instead of chairs around a table, the room is lined with couches, or clinei. You and the other guests, probably numbering between 7 and 15. Don't sit. You recline, 2 men to a couch, propped up on your left elbows, leaving your right hand free for eating and drinking. The very posture is one of leisure and intimacy. Wives are not present. This is an exclusively male space, with one notable exception we'll get to. The evening begins with the meal, the diapino. The food is served on low tables placed in front of your couch. Slaves move silently, bringing platters of fish, cheese, lentils, olives, and bread. Once the eating is done, the tables are cleared, and the real event begins. This is the symposium proper. The floor is swept, and slaves bring in the mixing bowl, the crater, filled with wine. This is the central, historical point. The Greeks never drank their wine straight. They always mixed it with water. To drink in mixed wine a gratin was considered barbaric, the habit of uncivilized peoples like the Scythians. It was a sign of a profound lack of self-control. The Symposia RCH, or Master of the Drinking, is chosen from among the guests. He decides the ratio of wine to water, a strong mix for a wild night, a weaker one for more serious conversation, and how many cups each guest must drink. The drinking is a communal, structured activity, not a free minus for minus all. Libations are poured to the gods, a hymn is sung, and then the wine begins to flow. Now, with the wine being passed around in a shared cup, the entertainment starts. And this is where it gets interesting. What did they actually do? Everything. They might engage in serious philosophical debate. Plato's famous dialogue, the Symposium, depicts Socrates and his friends discussing the nature of love, eros. In exactly this setting, they might recite poetry, or challenge each other to intellectual games like SKO Lion, where one guest would sing the first line of a verse and challenge another to complete it. But it wasn't all high-minded. For a weird, specific detail, let's talk about a popular party game called Kare Boss. To play, a guest would take the dregs from his wide, shallow wine cup, Achilles, and, with a flick of the wrist, fling the last drops of wine across the room to hit a target, often a small bronze disc balanced atop a stand. Hitting the target produced a satisfying clang. It was a game of skill, and bets were placed. Imagine a room full of tipsy, influential men, flicking sticky wind dregs across the room in a game of boozy target practice. It punctures the solemn, philosophical image a bit, doesn't it? As the night wears on and the wine takes hold, the entertainment could become more risque. This is where the exceptions to the all-male rule appeared. The host might hire entertainers, acrobats, magicians, and, most commonly, olos players, flute girls. These young women were not just musicians. They were entertainers, companions for the evening, and prostitutes. They would play music, dance, and sit with the guests, offering a very different kind of pleasure from the intellectual sparring. The pottery from the time is filled with scenes from the Symposium, showing men and flute girls in various states of intimacy. This brings us to a historical debate. What was the real purpose of the Symposium? Was it a sophisticated forum for the intellectual and political elite to bond, make deals, and shape the culture of the city, or was it just a pretext for a drunken debauch? The evidence is contradictory, and scholars are split. One camp, looking at sources like Plato and Xenophon, emphasizes the Symposium's role as a crucible of culture. It was where poetry was performed, philosophy was born, and young men learned the proper conduct of an elite citizen from their elders. It was a place for forming political alliances and strengthening the bonds of the aristocratic class. The drinking and entertainment were just social lubricants for a more serious purpose. The other camp points to the vast amount of archaeological evidence, the thousands of wine cups, the graphic depictions on vases, the remains of the Cate bust artists, and the condemnations of excessive drinking by some moralists. They argue that while intellectual conversation may have happened, the primary purpose for many was simply pleasure and release. They see the Symposium as a space of controlled chaos, a place where the strict rules of daytime society could be relaxed, though not entirely abandoned. The active-passive rules still held. It was a place for men to be off the clock, to indulge in wine and sensuality in a way that was sanctioned by tradition. The truth, most likely, is that it was both. A symposium could be a refined philosophical discussion on one night, and a wild, control party the next, depending entirely on the host and his guests. As you recline on your couch, cup in hand, you are at the very heart of male power and culture in Athens. The conversation, the wine, the games, the women. It's all part of a complex ritual that reaffirms your status, forges your alliances, and allows you a carefully structured form of release. We've spent a lot of time in your world, Damon's world, the bright, noisy, public world of men. But every house in Athens has another side, a hidden geography that is just as important. Now, we're going to leave the wine, scented air of the undrawn behind. We're going to push past the central courtyard of your home, into the shadows at the back. We are entering the Guinea icon, or Guinea, the women's quarters. This is a world of soft sounds, the rhythmic clacking of the loom, the murmur of voices, the cry of a small child. The light here is dimmer, filtered through a high, small window or borrowing what it can from the open air courtyard. The air smells of wool, cooking oil, and bread. This is the domain of your wife. Let's give her a name, Lyra. You married her 5 years ago. You didn't choose her. Your father and her father arranged the match. You probably saw her for the first time on your wedding day. She was 14. You were 30. Now, you stand at the threshold of her world, and it feels like a foreign country. Here, Lyra is the manager. She directs the household slaves in their tasks, grinding grain, fetching water, and, most importantly, producing the cloth that your family wears and uses. The central historical point to grasp about the life of a respectable Athenian wife is her profound seclusion. A good wife's reputation was built on her invisibility. the famous statesman Pericles, in a funeral oration recorded by Thucydides, summed up the ideal perfectly when he addressed the war widows. Your great glory is not to be inferior to what God has made you, and the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men, whether they are praising you or criticizing you. Think about that. The ultimate achievement for a woman was to be so discreet, so utterly absent from public life, that no one even had a reason to mention her name. Lyr's life is almost entirely confined to this space. She can leave the house for religious festivals, funerals, or to visit close female relatives, but she would always be veiled and, if possible, escorted. She would never go to the agora to shop. She would never attend the theater to see a play. She would never dream of setting foot in a symposium or the gymnasium. Her world was the oikos, the home. Her purpose was to manage it, above all, to produce a legitimate male heir for you. Daemon. Let's zoom in on a strange and specific detail of this world, the loom. The upright loom was the single most important piece of technology in the Gin-A icon. Weaving wasn't just a chore. It was the defining activity of a virtuous wife. It was her equivalent of a man's heroism in battle. In mythology, the most faithful and clever wife of all, Penelope, famously used her weaving to fend off her suitors while waiting for Odysseus to return. When you see a depiction of a respectable woman on a Greek vase, she is very often holding a spindle or standing before her loom. It was the symbol of her domestic virtue, her industry, and her fidelity. It was her full-time job, and the cloth she produced was a major economic contribution to the household. The deep separation of men's and women's spaces leads to a very interesting scholarly debate. Just how isolated were these women? Really, the traditional view, based on texts written by men like Pericles and Xenophon, paints a picture of near-minus total confinement, almost like a form of household imprisonment. These texts describe houses with doors that could be bolted from the outside to keep the women in, and they emphasize the need to shield women from any contact with unrelated men. This perspective sees the Gin icon as a gilded cage, designed to ensure the wife's fidelity and, by extension, the legitimacy of her sons. However, a growing number of historians and archaeologists are challenging this extreme view. They argue that the male writers were presenting an ideal, not the reality. It's a bit like reading a 1952 etiquette guide and assuming every single family lived that way. These revisionist scholars point to other forms of evidence. For instance, court speeches sometimes describe women talking to their neighbors over the wall or calling out from the roof. Archaeological evidence from some houses doesn't show a clear, lockable division between the male and female quarters. They also emphasize the importance of female-only religious festivals, like the Dies Immofuria, which gave women a legitimate reason to leave the home and congregate in large groups, completely free from male supervision. This school of thought doesn't deny that women's lives were restricted, but it suggests they had their own networks, their own social lives, and more agency than the official, male-authored text would have us believe. The debate is between seeing the Gin-A icon as a prison or as a separate, but still functional, social sphere. So, you look at Lyra. She is now 19. Her hands are skilled at the loom. She manages your home with quiet efficiency. She has given you a son. By every Athenian standard, she is a good wife. You are bound to her by law and by duty. But do you know her? Do you talk to her about your day in the agora? About your fears of a lawsuit? About your philosophical ponderings? Almost certainly not. Your worlds are designed to be separate. She is the guardian of your household's past and the vessel for its future. Your life, your real life as you see it, happens outside these walls. You are about to discover just how much of a transaction this all really is. Let's stay here, in the quiet of the Guinea icon, and talk about the reason this whole arrangement exists. We need to confront the reality of your marriage to Lara. It was not a union based on love, or even affection. It was a business deal, a contract between two families. The Greek word for marriage, ekdosis, literally means to give away. It was a transaction where Lyra's father, her Kyrios, gave her to you to become your wife. The primary, overarching purpose of this transaction was the production of legitimate children. This is the historical point that cannot be overstated. Your entire society was organized around the concept of citizenship and property, and both were passed down from father to son. For the system to work, you had to be absolutely certain that your son was your son. If he wasn't, he had no legal right to inherit your land, your property, or, most importantly, your status as an Athenian citizen. An illegitimate child could not be a citizen. Therefore, the fidelity of your wife was not a matter of private morality. It was a matter of state security and the preservation of the social order. This is why Lyra's life is so secluded. The walls of the Guinea icon, the rails, the escorts, all of it was a system of control designed to guarantee the legitimacy of your offspring. Her chastity was your family's most important asset. The marriage ceremony itself emphasized this. A key part of the ritual was the enye, a sort of public betrothal where her father would hand her over to you with the words, "I give you this woman for the plowing of legitimate children." The agricultural metaphor is stark and intentional. The woman was the field. The man was the plowman. The purpose was to crop a male heir. Now for a specific, and rather cold, detail of this transaction, the dowry. Lyra did not come to you empty-handed. Her father provided a dowry, a sum of money, or land, or valuable goods. This was a crucial part of the marriage contract. But here's the kicker: the dowry never legally became yours. You, Daemon, had control over it and could use the income it generated. But the principal amount always belonged to Lyra's original family. If you decided to divorce Lyra, or if she died without producing children, you were legally obligated to return the entire dowry to her father. What was the purpose of this? It wasn't to give Lyra financial independence. She had no control over the money herself. Historians see it as a form of insurance. For you, the husband, it was a strong financial incentive to treat your wife well and not divorce her frivolously. Losing a wife meant losing access to her dowry, which could be a significant financial blow. For her father, it was a guarantee that his daughter wouldn't be cast aside without cause, and that if the marriage failed, his family's wealth would not be lost to yours. The dowry turned the marriage into a binding financial arrangement that protected the interests of the men who made the deal. Lyra herself was simply the person to whom the dowry was attached. This transactional nature of marriage leads to a major debate among classicists. Was there any room for romance or personal choice at all? The dominant view is, for the most part, no. Marriages were arranged. The age gap was often significant. Men in their 30s marrying girls in their mid-teens. The decision was made by the fathers, with the economic and social standing of the families being the primary consideration. The bride and groom had little to no say in the matter. However, some scholars look for cracks in this monolithic facade. They point to evidence from a place like Gort Yn, on the island of Crete, where surviving law codes show a slightly different picture. The laws of Gort Yn allowed for a woman who was an epikale eros, a daughter who was the sole heir because there were no sons, to have some say in who she married. She had the right to refuse the man the law prescribed for her, usually her closest male relative, if she found him disagreeable, though she would have to forfeit a portion of her inheritance. This is a far cry from modern romantic choice, but it hints that in some parts of the Greek world, a woman's, or at least, a wealthy heiress's personal feelings were not entirely irrelevant. The debate, then, is whether Athens was the rigid, patriarchal rule, and places like Gortwayan were the exceptions, or if the Athenian model we read about in the texts is itself an oversimplification. Were there quiet negotiations, subtle expressions of preference that are lost to history? Could a father be swayed by his daughter's tears? We have no way of knowing for sure. The official record, loud and clear. Presence marriage is a public contract for procreation. Any love or affection that grew within it was a private, and likely unexpected, bonus. So you look at your wife, Lyra, and you see the living embodiment of your duty. She is the guardian of your lineage. Your intimacy with her is not an act of passion. It is an act of civic responsibility. It is the plowing required to produce the son who will one day take your place in the agora, inherit your property, and make offerings at your tomb. The entire structure of your society rests on this carefully managed, deeply impersonal transaction, and the consequences for breaking its terms, as we are about to see, were brutal. The air in the Guinea icon suddenly feels heavy. Doesn't it? The quiet seclusion of your wife, a wire's world, which once seemed merely restrictive, now reveals its sharper edge. It is a system built on one towering expectation, her absolute fidelity. We've established that you, Damon, have a world of socially acceptable options for intimacy outside your marriage. For Lyra, there are none. The double standard is not just a casual hypocrisy. It is a foundational pillar of your society, enshrined in law and enforced with terrifying severity. Let's be clear about the core historical fact: adultery, for a man, was not a crime. Your relationships with slaves, prostitutes, or even in some cases other men, were your own affair. The concept of you being unfaithful to your wife simply didn't exist in a legal or social sense. But if Lyra were to have a relationship with another man, it was a catastrophe of the highest order. The Greek word for this crime is moikia, and it was treated not as a private betrayal, but as a grave offense against the husband and the state. Why it all comes back to the central obsession: legitimate heirs. If Lyra had a lover, it would cast doubt on the paternity of her children. Your son, your heir, might not be your son at all. This would throw your entire lineage, your property transfer, and your family's civic status into chaos. An act of moiki, IA, polluted the oikos, the household, and threatened the very fabric of the citizen body. Therefore, the punishment had to be severe, not just to penalize the individuals, but to serve as a powerful deterrent to all other wives. If you were to catch a man, a moikoes, in the act with Lyra, we've already touched upon your rights. The law permitted you to kill him on the spot. This was justifiable homicide. Alternatively, you could choose to inflict a variety of other humiliating punishments or demand a huge sum of money from him in exchange for his life. But what about Lyra? You could not kill her, but you were legally required to divorce her immediately. To fail to do so would bring public disgrace and the loss of your own civic rights. You would be seen as a man who condoned the pollution of his own household. Once divorced, hers life was effectively over. She would be sent back to her father's house in disgrace. Her dowry returned. But the punishment didn't stop there. She was publicly shamed. An adulterous woman was forbidden by law from wearing any jewelry or fine clothes. More importantly, she was banned from participating in any public religious ceremonies. This was a form of social death, in a society where religion was deeply woven into community life. Being barred from the temples and festivals was to be made an outcast, a ghost in her own city. She would live out her days in shame and isolation. Now for a truly strange and specific detail that underscores the brutality of this system. One of the non-lethal punishments a husband could inflict on the man he caught, the moikoes, was known as rough anidosis. It involved, to put it delicately, shoving a large radish into the offender's backside, and then publicly depilating the area with hot ash as a mark of shame. Historians are still debating how common this practice actually was. Was it a real, frequent punishment or more of a comic threat? You'd see in a play by Aristophanes, the fact that it existed even as a concept speaks volumes. The punishment was designed to mimic a passive sexual act, to publicly humiliate the moikoes by forcing him into the most dishonorable role imaginable. He didn't just break a rule. He was demoted, symbolically transformed from an active citizen into a penetrated object of scorn. His crime wasn't loving a woman. It was trespassing on another man's property and violating his honor. This stark difference in consequences naturally fuels a continuous academic debate. Was this system purely about patriarchal property rights? Or were there other cultural anxieties at play? The traditional interpretation is straightforward. It's all about property, paternity, and power. Women were vessels for producing heirs, and moiki ia was a threat to the secure transfer of property, the son from one man, the father, to another, the son. The woman's desire or happiness was completely irrelevant to the legal equation. However, some scholars propose a more complex cultural reading. They argue that it also reveals a deep-seated male anxiety about female sexuality itself. In Greek medical texts and philosophy, female desire was often portrayed as unpredictable, animalistic, and dangerously potent if left unchecked. A woman's sexuality was something that had to be managed, contained, and controlled, lest it erupt and cause chaos. In this view, the harsh laws against adultery weren't just about protecting paternity. They were about controlling a perceived force of nature. The secluded Guinea icon was not just a practical measure to ensure legitimacy, but a necessary fortress to contain the wildness of the female. This theory suggests that the double standard was fueled by a mixture of practical patriarchy and a genuine, culturally ingrained fear of what women might do if given the freedom to choose. So, the silence in the Guinea icon is not one of peace, but of immense pressure. Every interaction Lyra has, every moment she is out of sight, is governed by this terrifying risk. The trust between you is not an emotional bond. It is a legal and social necessity, enforced by the threat of utter ruin. The system that gives you, the husband, almost limitless freedom is the very same system that places your wife in a cage of honor, where one misstep means a fall from which there is no recovery. This is the brutal calculus of the Athenian family. All right. Let's step out of the tense atmosphere of the household for a bit and turn our attention to one of the most famous, most analyzed, and most misunderstood aspects of ancient Greek society. We're going to talk about pederasty. It's a topic that often makes modern audiences uncomfortable, and for good reason. But to understand the world you're in, Damon's world, we have to look at it through their eyes, not ours. First, let's define our terms carefully. In the Athenian context, pederasty paiderastia refers to a socially institutionalized relationship between an adult male citizen, the aristes, the lover, the active partner, and a freeborn adolescent boy, the eromenos, the beloved, the passive partner. The ideal age for the eromenos was somewhere between puberty around 12-14 and the first growth of his beard around 18 for Archer. This was not a fringe practice. It was a widespread, and in many circles, celebrated institution among the aristocracy and the hoplite citizen minus soldier class. The central historical idea to grasp is that this relationship was, at least on the surface, framed as an educational and mentoring bond. It was not seen primarily as a sexual orientation. It was a phase of life, a rite of passage for the youth. The Eros, the older man, was expected to be a model of virtue for the younger Eromenos. He was to teach the boy about politics, ethics, philosophy, and proper social conduct. He was to be a guide, helping to shape the boy into a future upstanding citizen. The relationship was supposed to be a crucial part of the boy's education paedia, preparing him for his own future role as a citizen, a soldier, and eventually, a husband and father. In exchange for this mentorship, the boy was expected to grant his favor to the older man. This favor certainly had an affectionate and romantic dimension, and it's clear from art and literature that it often included a physical, intimate component. This is where our active-passive rule becomes critical again. The adult Aristes was always the active, pursuing partner. His masculinity was affirmed by his pursuit of the beautiful youth. The Eromenos, the boy, was in the passive role. This was acceptable only because he was not yet a full citizen. He was in a liminal, a minus between state, and his temporary passivity did not carry the same stigma it would for a grown man. In fact, being the object of an older, respected man's affection could bring a boy and his family considerable honor. Let's look at a specific, almost ritualized aspect of this, the courtship. This was not a casual affair. The Aristes was expected to pursue the Eromenos publicly. He would wait for the boy outside the gymnasium, send him gifts, a rooster or a hare were common, symbolic presents, write him poetry, and praise his beauty and virtue to others. The boy, in turn, was expected to be coy and resistant. He was not supposed to give in too easily. To do so would suggest he was promiscuous or driven by base desire. The ideal Eromenos was modest, virtuous, and was seen as bestowing his favor reluctantly, not out of passion, but out of an appreciation for the older man's wisdom and character. The whole affair was a highly stylized public performance of pursuit and virtuous reluctance. This idealized version, however, papers over some very difficult questions, leading to one of the most intense and ongoing debates in classical studies. Was Athenian pederasty a noble form of mentorship or a system of institutionalized exploitation? The idealist school of thought, which held sway for a long time, points to the writings of philosophers like Plato. In his dialogues, particularly the Symposium and Phaedrus, the love between a man and a boy is elevated to the highest form of eros. It is presented as a divine madness, a love that inspires both partners to strive for virtue and to contemplate a higher, spiritual form of beauty. According to this view, the physical aspect was secondary, a lower step on a ladder that led to philosophical enlightenment. This perspective emphasizes the educational benefits and the role of the relationship in forging bonds between generations of citizens. They see it as a noble institution that produced the leaders of the city. However, the realist or cynical school of thought, which has become much more prominent in recent decades, paints a facade architecture. These scholars argue that the educational aspect was often a thin veneer, a respectable excuse for the sexual desires of older men. They focus on the immense power imbalance between the adult Aristes and the adolescent Eromenos. They question the very possibility of consent from a boy being pursued by a powerful, wealthy, and socially influential adult. They point to passages in other texts, like the comedies of Aristophanes or certain court speeches, that portray these relationships in a much more transactional and sordid light, sometimes involving money or political favors. They also highlight the potential for psychological harm and the anxiety a boy might feel under such intense public scrutiny. This views the institution not as a noble mentorship, but as a system of exploitation that served the desires of the adult male elite at the expense of the youth. The historical truth is almost certainly messy and lies somewhere in between these two poles. It's highly likely that some of these relationships were genuinely affectionate and beneficial for the youth, while others were coercive and exploitative. The institution itself was flexible enough to contain both realities. It was a system that, in theory, aimed for the highest ideals of mentorship and love, but in practice, was deeply vulnerable to the universal human failings of lust, power, and selfishness. As you, Damon, walk past the gymnasium and see an older man in earnest conversation with a handsome youth, you are witnessing a scene that could be the beginning of a noble, formative friendship, or the opening move in a much more troubling game of power. The Greeks themselves seem to be wrestling with that same ambiguity. Let's stay with this complex relationship for a little longer and examine the official story, the way the Greeks themselves justified and idealized it. If you, as Damon, were to explain this institution to an outsider, you wouldn't talk about desire first. You would talk about virtue. You would present the relationship between an Aristes and his Eromenos as a pillar of society, a cornerstone of both military strength and civic education. The core of this official narrative, the central historical point, is that this form of love was superior to the love between a man and a woman because it was a relationship between two potential equals in mind and spirit. The love for a woman, in the dominant Athenian view, was for procreation. It was a relationship with someone they considered to be intellectually and morally inferior. But the love for a boy was a love for a future citizen, someone who possessed or would soon possess the capacity for reason, virtue, and courage. Therefore, this love, this eros, was seen as a powerful catalyst for excellence. You would argue that the Aristes, in his desire to be worthy of his beloved's admiration, would be inspired to act more virtuously. He would be more courageous in battle, more eloquent in the assembly, more noble in his conduct, because he knew the eyes of his Eromenos were upon him. Likewise, the Eromenos, eager to please his distinguished mentor, would strive to be more diligent in his studies, more disciplined in his training, and more honorable in his character. The love between them was a mutual engine of self-improvement. It wasn't just about personal feeling. It was about building a better citizen, and therefore a stronger city. This ideal is most famously articulated in a military context. The Sacred Band of Thebes, a real, elite infantry unit from the nearby city-minus state of Thebes, is the ultimate example. This force consisted of 150 pairs of male lovers. The theory, as recorded by writers like Plutarch, was that an army made up of such pairs would be invincible. The reasoning was simple and psychological. A man would fight with more reckless bravery and determination if he was fighting alongside his beloved. He would be ashamed to show cowardice in front of his partner, and he would die to protect him. The love between the soldiers was weaponized, turned into a force multiplier on the battlefield. The Sacred Band was, for a time, one of the most formidable fighting forces in all of Greece, a fact that seemed to provide concrete proof of the power of this type of bond. Now for a more specific, and perhaps surprising, detail about how this relationship was supposed to function. There was a very particular etiquette around the physical side of things. While the Aristes was the pursuer, The ideal Eromenos was not supposed to derive pleasure from the physical act. His role was to grant favor, not to enjoy it. The writer Xenophon, in his own Symposium, has Socrates argue that a boy who takes pleasure in the act is no better than a prostitute, while one who remains emotionally detached and grants his favor out of respect for the man's character is to be admired. The physical intimacy was framed as a gift from the boy to the man, a reward for the man's mentorship. The boy's virtue was paradoxically demonstrated by his lack of passion. This is, of course, a very convenient philosophy for the adult men who wrote it down. It placed all the emphasis on the man's desire and the boy's virtue, neatly erasing any discussion of the boy's own potential desires or feelings. This carefully constructed ideal leads to a fascinating historical debate. Was this educational framework just a high-minded excuse? Did anyone actually believe it on one side? You have scholars who take the philosophical texts at face value. They argue that for the educated elite, this ideology was very real. They believed that men like Plato and their circle genuinely saw pederasty as a spiritual and intellectual pursuit. They contend that the language of virtue, mentorship, and self-improvement was not just a smokescreen, but the genuine lens through which these relationships were understood and experienced, at least by the upper echelons of society. They argue that we should not impose our modern cynicism on a culture that may have genuinely believed in the transformative power of this kind of love. On the other side are the skeptics. They argue that the entire educational framework was a later, philosophical gloss put on a much more basic and ancient practice of warrior, bonding, and sexual hierarchy. They suggest that for the average Athenian citizen, the farmer, the merchant, the high-flow and rhetoric of Plato would have been meaningless. For them, the relationship was much simpler: a powerful man's perquisitant, a young man's rite of passage. These historians argue that the philosophical justification was a form of propaganda by the intellectual elite, an attempt to ennoble a practice that was, at its core, about power and pleasure. They point out that for every one of Plato's lofty dialogues, there are dozens of graffiti and vase paintings that depict the pursuit in much more direct, earthy, and frankly sexual terms, with little hint of any educational purpose. So, the official story you would tell is one of virtue, honor, and civic betterment. It's a story of a special kind of love that makes men better soldiers and better citizens. It's a quaint, noble, and inspiring narrative. But, as you tell it, you are aware of the gap between this perfect theory and the messy reality. You know that for every relationship that lived up to this ideal, there were others driven by less noble motives. The beautiful, polished surface of the ideology hides a much more complex and often troubling reality underneath. The gap between what people said they were doing and what they were actually doing is a space where historians are still digging, trying to find the truth. So we have the ideal version of pederasty, a noble mentorship, and we have the cynical view, a system of exploitation. The truth, as is often the case, is probably a chaotic mix of both. This is where we step directly into the heart of the historical debate, the gray area where the lines blur and the evidence becomes contradictory. This is the part of the story where we have to say, historians are still arguing about this, more than anywhere else. The core of the problem is this: the relationship was defined by a set of unwritten, and often conflicting, social rules. There was a right way and a wrong way to do it, and the line between them was dangerously thin. The primary distinction was between a respectable pederastic relationship and outright prostitution. A boy, an Eromenos, who accepted his older lover out of admiration for his character and in exchange for mentorship, was honored. But a boy who accepted a lover in exchange for money was a pornos, a male prostitute, and was despised. He would suffer the same legal and social penalties as the passive adult male. The keener eidos. He could lose his future citizenship rights. This distinction seems clear enough on paper, but in reality, it was incredibly blurry. What was the difference between an Aristes giving his beloved a gift, a common part of the courtship ritual, and paying him for his favor the intention? But how could you prove intention? A wealthy older man might shower a beautiful boy from a poorer family with expensive presents. Was this a noble expression of his affection? Or a thinly veiled financial transaction the boy's family might encourage the relationship, hoping for social or political advancement through the connection to the powerful man? Was the boy bestowing his favor out of virtue, or under pressure from his family to secure a patron? This ambiguity is the central theme of the historical debate. One side argues that the Greeks themselves were acutely aware of this moral hazard and policed it through social pressure. They point to the elaborate courtship rituals, the public pursuit, the boy's feigned reluctance, as a way of proving the relationship was honorable. By making the courtship a public performance, the Aristes demonstrated that his intentions were serious and not merely transactional. The boy's resistance, in turn, demonstrated his virtue and his freedom from mercenary motives. The whole system was a piece of social theater designed to separate the noble from the base. The opposing view is that this theater was often just a facade. Skeptical historians argue that the line between gift and payment was deliberately kept blurry to allow for a wide range of behaviors to exist under the respectable cover of mentorship. They argue that economic need was a powerful, unspoken factor in many of these relationships. A boy from a non-elite family had few paths to social mobility, and attracting a wealthy and powerful patron, even at a personal cost, could be a rational choice. These scholars suggest that the intense focus on not accepting money was a way for the aristocratic elite to maintain their monopoly on the respectable form of pederasty, while conveniently ignoring the economic realities that drove many young men into more transactional arrangements. The debate is essentially about whether the rules were a genuine moral guide or a convenient social fiction. Let's look at a weird, specific piece of evidence that highlights this ambiguity of the law. We've mentioned the law against Team Archus, where Aeschines prosecutes his rival for having been a male prostitute in his youth. Aeschines' whole case rests on trying to prove that Team Archus's relationships were transactional. But his opponent, Demicius, argues back, essentially saying, so what if he had older male lovers? Everyone does. You're just trying to smear him. The fact that this could even be a subject of a major public trial shows how high the stakes were, and how difficult it was to draw a firm line. The very same action, a boy having a relationship with an older man, could be framed as either a noble part of his education or a shameful act of prostitution, depending entirely on the narrative you chose to spin. Ultimately, the biggest source of the ongoing debate is the nature of the evidence itself. Almost everything we have was written by the Aristes class. The adult, elite men, Plato, Xenophon, the vase painters, the poets, they are all telling the story from the man's point of view. The voice of the Eromenos, the boy, is almost completely silent. We don't have diaries, letters, or memoirs from these boys telling us how they felt. Did they feel honored, exploited, affectionate, afraid, confused? We have to guess. To read between the lines of texts written by their pursuers. Some historians try to reconstruct the boy's experience by looking for subtle clues. They might analyze vase paintings to see if the boy's posture suggests affection or discomfort. They might scrutinize the language in poetry for hints of the boy's own agency or feelings. This field, sometimes called the archaeology of silence, is trying to recover a lost perspective, but it's incredibly difficult and speculative work. The debate rages on because the key witnesses can't speak. We are left with the official story, full of high ideals, and a collection of troubling clues that suggest a much messier, more painful reality for some. The true nature of this central Greek institution remains one of history's most compelling and unresolved arguments. Oh, right. We've spent a lot of time in the rarefied air of the aristocracy, with their philosophical justifications and their complex social codes. Now it's time to take a walk to a different part of the city. Let's head down from the elegant homes where symposiums are held, towards the bustling, grittier areas around the port of Piraeus or near the Agora. Here, the transcational nature of intimacy isn't hidden behind a veil of mentorship and virtue. It's open, it's honest, and it's cheap. We're going to meet the pornei. The word porni plural, pornei, is the root of our modern word pornography. Its meaning in ancient Greek was direct and unflattering. It simply meant prostitute, or more literally, one who is for sale. This is the critical historical point. The pornei were at the absolute bottom of the social and sexual hierarchy. They were not romanticized. They were not seen as objects of eros in the noble sense. They were a utility, a public service for the satisfaction of basic male sexual needs. A man like you, daemon, or any other man in Athens, citizen, foreigner, or even a slave with a bit of coin, could visit a porny without any social stigma whatsoever. It was considered a normal, unremarkable activity. In fact, many Greeks would have seen it as a positive social good. The availability of cheap, easy sex was thought to protect the chastity of respectable wives and daughters. It provided a safe outlet for male desire that wouldn't disrupt the all-important family structure. The great Athenian lawgiver Solon was even credited with establishing state-owned brothels for this very reason, to promote social stability. Who were these women overwhelmingly? They were slaves or, in some cases, foreigners or destitute free women with no other options. Many were owned by a pornoboskues, a brothel minus keeper, who was himself a deeply despised figure in society. The life of a pornee was one of almost complete powerlessness. She had no legal rights, no control over her own body, and her price was often astonishingly low. This brings us to a specific, and rather grim, detail of their existence: the price. We have evidence from comedic plays and other texts that suggests the price for a visit to a brothel worker could be as low as 1 obol. To put that in perspective, there were 6 obols in a drachma. A drachma was roughly the average daily wage for a skilled worker. So, the cost of a sexual encounter could be the equivalent of what you might pay for a cheap loaf of bread. This incredibly low price tells you everything you need to know about the value placed on these women's lives and bodies. They were a commodity, and a cheap one at that. The brothels themselves were often just small, single rooms, sometimes marked with a lit lamp or a painted phallus above the door. It was a world stripped of all romance and pretense. The existence of this class of women feeds into a long-standing historical debate. How did the prevalence of prostitution affect the Greek view of women in general? One side of the argument posits that the clear division between the respectable wife and the debased pornee was actually a way of protecting the honor of the wife, by creating a separate class of women onto whom all the negative aspects of reality could be projected. Society could elevate the wife into a pure, untouchable figurehead of the household. In this view, the pornee acts as a kind of firewall, absorbing the unclean aspects of male desire so that the Gene icon could remain a sacred space. This argument suggests a deeply misogynistic but functionally stable system where every woman had a clearly defined and unequal role. The other side of the debate argues that this system degraded all women. They contend that the easy availability of women as cheap commodities couldn't help, but color the perception of the entire female sex. If one category of woman was literally property for sexual use, it made it easier to view all women through a lens of ownership and utility. This perspective argues that you can't neatly compartmentalize misogyny. The contempt shown for the porny inevitably bled over into the general attitude towards wives and daughters, reinforcing the idea that all women were, at their core, irrational, untrustworthy, and defined by their sexuality. Was the porny a necessary evil that protected the respectable woman, or was she the ultimate symbol of a society that held all women in low esteem? The debate gets to the heart of how deep the misogyny of this culture actually ran. So as you walk these less glamorous streets, the smell of cheap wine and cooking fires thick in the air, you see a side of Athens that is brutally practical. There are no poems being written here, no philosophical debates on the nature of beauty. There is only commerce. The pornei represent the stark reality that underpins the entire social structure you've seen. The freedom of the Athenian man, his ability to compartmentalize his life into wife for procreation, boy for education, and companions for pleasure, was all made possible by the existence of a class of people who had no freedom at all. The world of the pornei is the grim, unaccumulated foundation upon which the glittering Parthenon and the lofty ideals of the philosophers were built. Let's stay in this world for a moment longer. In the red-light districts of Athens, the life of a porny was bleak, but understanding the mechanics of her existence reveals a lot about the city's underbelly. We've established her social standing, or lack thereof. But what was her daily reality? It was a life lived at the mercy of others, defined by a complete absence of agency. The central historical reality for a porny was that she was, in most cases, property. If she was a slave owned by a brothel keeper porn boscoess, her life was not her own in any sense of the word. Her earnings went to her master. He decided whom she saw, how many clients she had, and what she was allowed to wear or eat. She was subject to physical abuse from both her master and her clients with virtually no legal recourse. If a client harmed her, it was the master who might sue for damage to his property, not the woman for the injury done to her. Her body was a tool for generating income for someone else, even for the few pornei who might have been technically free. Perhaps a woman who had fallen into destitution and had no other way to survive. The situation was only marginally better, without a male guardian or protector. She was a vulnerable figure in a society that offered few protections to unattached women. She would have to pay taxes on her meager earnings and was still an object of social scorn. Freedom, in this context, was just the freedom to starve or sell herself. Now for a specific, and quite sad, detail of this life: their names. Often, the names we see for prostitutes in ancient texts, particularly in comedies, are not real Greek names. They are generic, often descriptive nicknames. We find names like Myra Rhine Myrtle, a plant associated with Aphrodite, Gl. Cara Sweetie, or Natty on a diminutive, cutesy name, like Tiny. These were not their given names. These were their work names, their brand names. This practice of renaming had a powerful dehumanizing effect. It stripped them of their individual identity, their connection to their family, and their past. They became a type, not a person. A sweetie is not a woman with a history and a family. She is a pride, packaged for consumption. This world of exploitation also had its own strange legal and social quirks. There's a persistent, though debated, myth that brothel-minus workers were required by law to wear a specific style of colorful, flashy clothing to distinguish them from respectable, modestly dressed wives. This is what some historians refer to as the uniform of shame. The idea was to make social categories instantly visible on the street. You could tell a good woman from a bad woman at a glance. This leads to a fascinating historical argument. Was this clothing regulation a real law, or just a social convention that later writers mistook for a law? Some historians believe that there were, indeed, some pt.ure laws regulating dress and adornment, that explicitly targeted prostitutes. They see it as another tool of social control, a way of marking and marginalizing a specific group of people. The colorful dress was a public badge of their status, preventing any possible confusion with the chaste and soberly dressed wives and daughters of citizens. Other historians are more skeptical. They argue that we have very little hard, contemporary evidence for such a law. No surviving legal inscription spells it out. Instead, they suggest that this was simply a matter of economic reality and social convention. Prostitutes dressed in more alluring or flamboyant ways to attract clients, just as they do in many cultures. Respectable women dressed modestly because that was the expectation for their class. Over time, these conventions became so entrenched that later Roman and Christian writers, looking back at classical Greece, misinterpreted this custom as a formal legal requirement. The debate is a classic example of a historical fact that might just be a long-standing myth. Was it the law of the state or the law of the market that dictated how these women dressed? The answer reveals whether their shame was legally mandated or simply socially enforced. The life of a pornée was, by any measure, brutal, but it also existed in a strange paradox. While the individual woman was despised and powerless, the institution of prostitution itself was seen as a social necessity. It was the sewer that kept the city clean, the release valve that protected the honor of the family. The men who used these services, from the highest aristocrat to the lowest laborer, saw no contradiction in this. They could feel contempt for the woman herself, while simultaneously believing her services were essential for a well-ordered society. This is the grim reality you, as Damon, would have accepted without a second thought. The existence of the pornée. I was part of the natural landscape of your city, as unremarkable as the olive trees on the hills. They were the invisible women who made the visible world of male freedom possible. Their lives, lived in the shadows of the agora and the port, were short, hard, and almost entirely unrecorded by history, save for the mocking nicknames and the cold calculus of their price. All right, let's leave the grim realities of the brothels behind and climb the social ladder. Because in the complex ecosystem of Athenian intimacy, there was another category of woman who existed outside the confines of marriage, and she was worlds away from the disposable pornée. We are now going to meet the hetaira. The word hetaira plural, hetero, I literally translates to female companion. This is the first clue that we are in a completely different social universe. While a wife was a plow-able field for heirs and a pornée was a body for sale, a hetaira was a companion. This is the crucial historical point. The hetaira were not simply high-class prostitutes. They were, at their best, educated, witty, and artistically talented women who provided not just physical intimacy, but intellectual companionship for the wealthy and powerful men of the city. Think of the things that were missing from a man like Damon's relationship with his wife, Lyra. He couldn't discuss politics with her. He couldn't debate philosophy with her. He couldn't share his appreciation for poetry or music with her. A respectable wife was uneducated and secluded by design. The hetaira filled this vacuum. She could do all of those things. She was often skilled in playing a musical instrument like the aulos or the lyre. She could hold her own in a conversation about current events, and she was trained in the art of being a charming and engaging host. For this reason, Hetairai were the only women permitted to attend the symposium, the all-male drinking party. They were there not just as sexual partners, but as entertainers and conversationalists who could elevate the tone of the entire evening. Who became a Hetairai, their backgrounds were more varied than those of the poor Nei. Some were slaves, who were specially trained from a young age by their owners. Others were for unwomen medics, who were not bound by the same strict rules of seclusion as Athenian citizen women. Some were even the daughters of other Hetairai. What they had in common was an education and a level of social polish that was denied to citizen wives. This leads us to a fascinating and slightly strange detail of their profession. They were often known for a specific skill. One Hetairai might be famous for her beautiful singing voice, another for her sharp-witted ability to trade jokes with the city's most famous comedians, and another for her mastery of philosophical concepts. They cultivated a personal brand, unlike the anonymous porny with her generic nickname. A famous Hetairai was a public figure. Her name was known. Her liaisons were the subject of gossip and comedy. She could become a celebrity in her own right. The relationship between a man and a Hetairai was also fundamentally different. It wasn't a one-time transaction for a few obols. It was often a long-term arrangement. A man might become the sole patron of a Hetairai, effectively setting her up in her own house and providing for her completely. These relationships could be deeply affectionate and last for years. While a man's marriage was a public duty, his relationship with a Hetairai was a private choice, and therefore it was often the place where he sought genuine emotional connection and intellectual partnership. This unique position of the Hetairai has sparked a major historical debate. Were they empowered feminists, or just a more glamorous form of property? The empowerment argument focuses on the undeniable social and cultural influence some of these women wielded. They were the most educated and public women in Athens. They could accumulate significant personal wealth. They associated with the leading statesmen, philosophers, and artists of their day. In a society that systematically silenced and secluded its respectable women, the Hetairai had a public voice and a degree of independence that was unparalleled. This school of thought sees them as women who cleverly navigated a patriarchal system to achieve a level of freedom and influence that was otherwise impossible. They were the exception that proves the rule, a class of women who broke the mold. The opposing argument, however, is much more critical. These scholars argue that we shouldn't romanticize the Hetairai. At the end of the day, her livelihood was still dependent on the favor of powerful men. Her freedom was conditional. If her patron abandoned her, or if her beauty faded, she could easily slide down the social ladder into poverty or common prostitution. They also point out that even the most famous Hetairai was still an outsider. She could never be a citizen. Her children could never be citizens. She was admired for her wit and beauty, but she was never truly respectable. She was, in this view, simply a more expensive, better-packaged commodity. Her education and talents were not a sign of her empowerment, but rather a set of skills designed to make her a more desirable possession for an elite man. She wasn't a feminist trailblazer. She was the ultimate luxury good in a patriarchal marketplace. The reality, as always, is likely a blend of both. The Hetairai lived in a state of profound paradox. They were more educated than wives, but less respectable. They had more freedom but less security. They could wield great informal influence but had no formal power. They were companions to the most powerful men in the world, but they were always, ultimately, outsiders. As you, Damon, might consider beginning a liaison with a well-known Hetairai. You would be seeking something your wife could never provide, a partner for your mind as well as your body. But this relationship, for all its potential for genuine connection, still operates within the rigid framework of a world where men hold all the real power. To truly understand the unique and powerful position a Heta era could occupy, we need to move beyond hypotheticals and look at a real, historical figure. We need to talk about Aspasia of Miletus. She is, without a doubt, the most famous Heta era in all of history. A woman whose intelligence and influence were so great that she became a major player in the golden age of Athens. Despite being both a woman and a foreigner, Aspasia arrived in Athens sometime in the mid-5th century BCE. She came from Miletus, a Greek city in Ionia, modern -day Turkey, that was known for its vibrant intellectual culture. This is a key part of her story. As a Milesian, she likely received an education that was simply unavailable to the women of Athens. She was not just literate. She was, by all accounts, a brilliant thinker and a master of rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. Here is the central historical point. Aspasia became the long-term partner of Pericles, the most powerful and influential statesman in Athens during its peak. This was not a casual affair or a back-alley liaison. Pericles, who was already married to an Athenian citizen, divorced his wife and lived with Aspasia openly. Because Athenian law forbade a citizen from marrying a foreigner, they could not legally wed. But for all intents and purposes, she was his partner, his companion, and his equal in a way his former wife could never have been. Their home became a leading intellectual salon in Athens. The greatest minds of the era, philosophers like Socrates, playwrights like Sophocles, artists like Phidias, all flocked to her house to engage in conversation. This is an astonishing fact. In a city where respectable men and women did not socialize together, Aspasia hosted what was essentially a co-said symposium. She didn't just serve the wine. She participated in the debates. The great philosopher Plato even mentions her by name, and Socrates himself is said to have claimed that he learned the art of rhetoric from her. This brings us to a wonderfully specific and controversial detail about her influence. There is a persistent story, reported by several ancient writers, including Plutarch, that Aspasia actually wrote or helped to write one of Pericles' most famous speeches, his funeral oration. This was the legendary speech we mentioned earlier, delivered in honor of the soldiers who died in the first year of the Peloponnesian War. It is considered one of the masterpieces of rhetoric and a defining statement of Athenian democratic ideals. The idea that a woman, and a foreign Hetaira at that, was the secret author behind the city's most iconic speech was a scandalous and tantalizing rumor. This rumor is at the heart of a major historical debate: how much of Aspasia's reputation is fact, and how much is fiction created by her enemies. One camp of historians takes the ancient sources more or less at their word. They believe Aspasia was a genuine intellectual powerhouse, a pioneering female thinker whose contributions were systematically downplayed or twisted by a misogynistic society. They argue that the stories of her teaching Socrates and writing speeches for Pericles are likely exaggerations based on a kernel of truth, that she was his most trusted advisor and intellectual partner. In this view, she is a lost female genius, a victim of a historical record written entirely by men who were either baffled or threatened by her. The other camp is far more skeptical. They argue that the figure of Aspasia has been mythologized. They point out that most of the stories about her come from sources written long after she died, or from comic playwrights who were known for slander and exaggeration. The comedians of Athens loved to mock Pericles, and what better way to attack him than by claiming he was run by his foreign mistress? They portrayed her as a manipulative puppet master, a brothel keeper who pushed Pericles into starting wars to protect her business interests. These skeptical historians argue that the intellectual Aspasia might be a caricature, an invention of her enemies to shame Pericles. They suggest she may have been a charming and intelligent companion, but the idea that she was a major philosophical figure or a ghostwriter for statesmen is a romantic fantasy. Was she a brilliant political advisor or a convenient scapegoat, a proto-feminist intellectual, or a celebrity courtesan whose story was blown out of proportion? Historians continue to sift through the biased and fragmentary evidence, trying to uncover the real woman behind the legends and the slander. What is certain is that Aspasia lived a life that was impossible for any other woman of her time in Athens. She was a foreigner who became the companion of the city's greatest leader. She was a woman who was celebrated for her mind, not just her beauty. She was a Hetaira who transcended the role and became a force in her own right. Her story, whether fact or embellished fiction, illustrates the absolute peak of what a woman outside the traditional system could achieve. She represents the highest potential and the inherent contradictions of the life of a Hetaira. Now that we've met Lyra, your secluded wife, and Aspasia, the celebrated Hetaira, let's place them side by side. This juxtaposition is not just a comparison of two individuals. It's a snapshot of the deep, irreconcilable chasm in the lives of women in ancient Athens. The contrast between them reveals everything about the values, priorities, and anxieties of your world. Let's start with the most fundamental difference: respect versus influence. Lyra, your wife, has respectability, Ados. Her honor is your honor. She is the legitimate spouse of a citizen, the future mother of citizens. Her position is secure, protected by law and tradition. She is a cornerstone of the social order, the guardian of the oikos. But this respect comes at the cost of her freedom. She is invisible, uneducated, and voiceless in the public sphere. Her power is confined entirely within the walls of your home. Aspasia, on the other hand, has influence. She is a public figure. Her opinions are heard. Her wit is celebrated, and her company is sought by the most powerful men in the city. She has access to the worlds of politics, philosophy, and art, all realms that are strictly forbidden to Lyra. She has an intellectual and social freedom that an Athenian wife could not even dream of. But this influence comes at the cost of her respectability. She is, and always will be, an outsider. She can never be a citizen's legal wife. Her children will never be full citizens. Her position is precarious, dependent on her charm, her intelligence, and the continued favor of her patron. She is admired, but she is not honorable in the way Lyra is. This is the central, brutal trade-minus off for women in Athens. You could have honor or you could have freedom, but you could not have both. This is the historical point that defines the female experience. The system was designed to prevent any one woman from accumulating both domestic respectability and public influence. Let's look at a specific, tangible example of this contrast: their physical movement. LYI, as movements are circumscribed and purposeful. If she leaves the house, it is to attend a family funeral or a state-sanctioned female religious festival. She is veiled, escorted, and her eyes are downcast. Her journey is from one private space, her home, to another, a relative's home or a temple. The public street is merely a conduit, a space to be passed through as quickly and invisibly as possible. Aspasia's movements are entirely different. She attends the Symposium. She walks through the agora and engages in conversation. Men come to her home to seek her counsel. Her physical presence in the male-dominated public spaces of the city is a testament to her unique status. She moves with a confidence and purpose that would be scandalous for a citizen wife. The very map of the city is different for these two women. Entire zones are open to one and closed to the other. This stark contrast has fueled a long running debate among feminist historians which life was better this is. Of course, a deeply anachronistic question, but it's a useful thought experiment. The traditional view would instinctively say that the wife, Lyra, had the better life. She had security, a defined and honored place in society, and the protection of her husband and family. She fulfilled the role that the society deemed most virtuous for a woman. The Hetaira, for all her glamour, was in a morally and socially compromised position. However, many modern feminist scholars challenge this assumption. They ask, what is the value of honor if it requires the complete erasure of your personality and intellect? They argue that Aspasia, despite her lack of security and formal status, lived a fuller, more human life. She had agency. She made choices. She developed her mind. She participated in the great cultural conversations of her time. From a modern perspective that values self-actualization and personal freedom, Aspasia's precarious but vibrant life might seem far more appealing than Lyra's safe but stifling existence. There is no easy answer, and the debate forces us to confront our own values. Do we prize security and respectability, or freedom and influence? Athenian society forced women to make that choice. As you, Damon, exist in this world, you benefit from both. You have Lyra at home, guaranteeing your lineage and managing your household with quiet, respectable efficiency. Her virtue is a reflection on you. And you might also have a Hetaira like Aspasia, or a less famous version in your life, providing the intellectual stimulation and companionship that your marriage lacks. You are not forced to choose. You can have both a wife and a lover, both duty and pleasure, both an heir and a companion. The system is perfectly designed to serve your needs. The cost of that system is borne by the women, who are forced into two mutually exclusive roles, neither of which constitutes a complete life by our modern standards. The wife is a body without a public mind, and the Hetaira is a mind without a respectable body. The fragmentation of the Athenian man's desires resulted in the fragmentation of the female experience. We've spent a lot of our time in Athens, a city whose social structure was famously rigid and patriarchal. But the Greek world was not a monolith. Different city-states had different customs. And to get a more complete picture, we need to take a short trip. Let's sail across the Aegean Sea to the island of Lesbos. During a slightly earlier period, around 600 BCE, here, in the city of Metropolitan, we find a different voice, one that offers a rare and precious glimpse into the emotional world of women. We are here to listen to the poet Sappho. Sappho is one of the most famous poets of the ancient world, but our knowledge of her is tragically fragmentary. Most of her work, which once filled 9 papyrus scrolls, has been lost to time. What we have are scraps, single lines, and a few nearly complete poems, preserved on torn pieces of papyrus or quoted by later authors. Yet, even in these fragments, her voice is astonishingly clear, personal, and passionate. The central historical point about Sappho is that she wrote primarily about the love and desire between women. She was the head of a theasos, a kind of informal academy or finishing school for young, upper-class girls. In this all-female community, girls would learn music, poetry, and the social graces before they were sent off to be married. Sappho's poems seem to have been written for and within this circle. They are intensely personal, expressing her deep affection, her jealousy, her lying, and her heartbreak as these young women came and went from her life. In her work, the world of men, of politics, war, and the agora is almost entirely absent. Her focus is on the intimate, emotional lives of her female companions. She writes about the beauty of a specific girl, the pain of separation, the memory of shared moments in a sunlit garden. It is a world rendered with a level of emotional detail and psychological depth that is simply missing from the male-minus authored texts we've been discussing. She gives a voice to a perspective that is otherwise almost completely silent in the historical record. Let's look at a specific, tangible detail from her world, her language. Sappho's poetry is famous for its visceral descriptions of the physical sensations of love. In her most famous complete poem, often called Fragment 31, she describes her reaction to seeing the girl she loves sitting and talking with a man. She writes, "My tongue is broken. A thin flame runs under my skin. In my eyes is no sight. My ears are roaring. Sweat pours down me. A trembling seizes me all over. I am greener than grass, and I seem to myself to be little short of dying." This is not an abstract, philosophical discussion of Eros. This is a gut-minus-punch of a description, a direct report from the front lines of human emotion. It's a universal feeling, rendered with a personal intensity that feels incredibly modern. The existence of Sappho and her poetry has, of course, led to centuries of debate, starting in antiquity and continuing firstly today. The debate centers on a simple question: what was the real nature of these relationships? She describes, was this love platonic, or was it physical? The very word lesbian comes from the name of her island, Lesbos, a testament to her enduring association with love between women. One side of the debate, popular in more conservative eras, has tried to demonize sexualize Sappho. They argue that she was simply a respectable teacher, a kind of headmistress, and that her expressions of love were purely metaphorical or pedagogical. They see her as a mentor expressing a deep but non-minus physical affection for her students, preparing them for their future lives as wives and mothers. They interpret her passionate language as a conventional, poetic way of expressing friendship, not physical desire. The other side of the argument, which is held by the vast majority of modern classicists, finds this view to be a willful misreading of the evidence. They argue that the language of her poetry is so intensely erotic, so focused on physical beauty and bodily reactions, that to deny a sexual component is absurd. They contend that in the unique, semi-minus, secluded environment of the all-minus female theasos, it is entirely plausible that romantic and physical relationships would have flourished. This doesn't mean it was an orientation in the modern sense, but rather that in this specific context, before the girls were married off to men, their primary emotional and erotic attachments were to each other. This view doesn't see Sappho as a lesbian in a modern political identity sense, but as a woman who loved other women and wrote about it with an honesty that later more patriarchal societies found shocking. The truth is, we can never know for certain the exact nature of life inside Sappho's circle, but her poetry stands as a powerful counter-minus narrative to the Athens-minus-centric story we have been telling. It reminds us that the female experience in the Greek world was not uniform. In some places, at some times, there were spaces where women's voices, women's emotions, and women's relationships with each other took center stage. Sappho's world was not a paradise. The girls she loved were still destined for arranged marriages with men. Her poems are filled with the sorrow of these inevitable departures. But for a brief time, on an island in the Aegean, there was a space where women's love for women was the subject of the most beautiful art. It's a fragment of a different kind of reality, a precious glimpse into a world that was almost entirely written out of history. Let's sail back from the lyrical, female-minus-centered world of Lesbos and return to the mainland, to the heart of male society. We're going to a place that is just as central to the life of an Athenian man as the Agora or the Symposium. We are going to the gymnasium. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked, and that is your first and most important clue. The gymnasium was not just a place for exercise. It was a place where men and boys gathered, socialized, trained, and, yes, did so completely naked. This was not considered shameful or even particularly sexual. It was simply the way things were done. Public nudity, in the specific context of athletic training, was a hallmark of Greek culture and something that other civilizations, like the Persians and later the Romans, found deeply strange. The main historical point here is that the gymnasium was far more than a sports facility. It was a cultural institution. It was a fusion of a health club, a community center, and a school. Wealthy men would spend a significant portion of their day here. They would exercise, of course, running, wrestling, discus and javelin throwing, and the long jump were the core activities. But after their physical training, they would scrape themselves clean with their strigils, bathe, and then just hang out. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle established their famous schools, the Academy and the Lyceum, right next to gymnasia, because that's where their target audience of wealthy, leisured young men could be found. You could go from a wrestling match to a lesson on the nature of the soul without ever leaving the grounds. Now for a specific, and to our modern eyes, quite peculiar detail, the appreciation of the male physique. In the gymnasium, the male body was on open display, and it was openly admired. This was not a subtle or hidden aspect of the culture. It was central to it. The ideal male body, athletic, toned, and youthful, was considered a manifestation of inner virtue. A good body reflected a good soul. This is why Greek sculpture is so dominated by the figure of the nude male youth, the kouros. These statues were not just art. They were representations of a cultural ideal, born in the wrestling grounds par excellence of the gymnasium. An older man openly admiring the body of a youth was not seen as creepy. It was seen as an aesthetic and philosophical appreciation of beauty and potential. This was, of course, also the primary hunting ground for an aristes looking for a potential eromenos. The gymnasium was the stage upon which the whole drama of pederastic courtship played out. The function and atmosphere of the gymnasium have sparked a significant academic debate. Was this a hyper-minus masculine, competitive space, or a homoerotic one? The answer, which frustrates our modern desire for clear categories, is that it was both, simultaneously, and the Greeks saw no contradiction between the two. The hyper-minus masculine argument points to the gymnasium's core function: training for warfare. The skills practiced there, running, wrestling, throwing, were all directly applicable on the battlefield. It was a place for men to toughen their bodies, to engage in fierce competition, and to establish a pecking order based on physical prowess. It was about making men strong, disciplined, and ready to defend the polis. In this view, the gymnasium is a crucible of martial masculinity. The nudity was practical, less restrictive for movement, and a way to foster a sense of shared identity androgynous among the citizen minus soldiers. The homoerotic argument, on the other hand, focuses on the undeniable aesthetic and romantic element. The open admiration of nude bodies, the presence of older men courting younger boys, the celebration of male beauty in art and poetry. All of it points to the gymnasium being the primary theater of male minus male desire. It was a space where the eros that Plato and others described was kindled. They argue that you cannot separate the athletic function from the erotic one. The very act of watching, judging, and admiring these young, naked bodies was a central part of the experience for the older, elite men who frequented the place. The most sophisticated view, and the one most historians now hold, is that this is a false dichotomy. The gymnasium was a space where martial masculinity and homoerotic desire were completely intertwined. For the Greeks, there was no conflict between being a tough, competitive warrior and admiring the beauty of another man. In fact, as we saw with the sacred band of Thebes, the erotic bond was seen as something that could enhance military effectiveness. The admiration of a beautiful young man's body was also an admiration of his potential as a future warrior. The two concepts were fused. So, as you, Damon, walk through the grounds of the gymnasium, you are surrounded by the sights and sounds of this fusion. You hear the thud of bodies hitting the dirt in the wrestling pit, the shouts of men competing in a foot race. You see the sheen of olive oil on skin, the focused expressions of athletes, and you also see the groups of older men, leaning on their staffs, watching, talking, their gaze following a particularly graceful or strong young man as he practices. It is a world of pure, unadulterated maleness, where physical strength, civic duty, and desire all mix under the hot Athenian sun. It is a world that is completely, fundamentally alien to our own, and yet central to understanding theirs. So far, we've been piecing together this world from philosophical texts, court speeches, and poetry. But now, let's look at a different kind of evidence. Let's pick up something you might have used every single day, a painted clay pot. We're going to look at the pictures on Greek vases, because these objects, which we now see isolated in sterile museum cases, were the Tupperware and the fine china of their day, and they are covered in scenes that can be shockingly candid. You might have a large crater for mixing wine and water at your symposium, a wide, shallow calyx to drink from, or a tall amphora for storing olive oil. These pots were not just functional. They were the canvases for an incredibly rich visual culture. And they were not shy. The images painted on them provide some of our most direct, unfiltered evidence for the social and sexual norms of ancient Athens. The key historical point here is that Greek vase painting corroborates and illustrates almost every aspect of the intimate life we've been discussing. The images serve as a visual guide to the unspoken rules. You can find thousands of vases depicting scenes from the Symposium, with men reclining on their couches, playing carte bosse, listening to flute girls, and getting progressively more drunk and rowdy. You can see countless scenes of pederastic courtship the older, bearded Aristes offering a gift like a hare or a rooster to the younger, beardless Eromenos. The roles are always visually clear. The active-passive, dominant-submissive dynamic is spelled out in the way the figures are drawn. These vases also depict mythological scenes, which often have their own erotic undertones. Zeus, the king of the gods, is frequently shown pursuing mortal women, or, in the case of Ganymede, a beautiful young boy. These myths, painted on everyday objects, served as a divine precedent, a kind of celestial permission slip for the behavior of mortal men. But most startlingly, many vases show explicit sexual acts. There are scenes featuring men with porneai, men with heterai, men with other men, and even men with satyrs, the mythological half-minus man. Half-minus go creatures known for their insatiable appetites. The frankness is jarring to our sensibilities. It's like finding detailed pornographic cartoons on your dinner plates. Now for a specific, and rather curious, detail you can observe on these pots. While they are incredibly explicit about almost every other form of intimacy, there is one major, glaring omission. You almost never see a scene depicting a husband and wife in an explicitly sexual context. You see wedding processions. You see domestic scenes of the wife at her loom. You see scenes of affection, like a husband holding his wife's hand. But the kind of graphic intimacy that is shown so freely in other contexts is almost completely absent when it comes to the married couple. This omission is hugely significant and has led to a major scholarly debate why this silence. What does the absence of marital sex in art tell us? One theory is that it was a matter of respect and decorum. The bedroom of the citizen minus wife, the Guinea icon, was a sacred, private space. To depict what happened there on a public object, like a wine cup, would have been a gross violation of the wife's honor and the sanctity of the household. It was simply too private, too important, to be turned into a decoration. The act of procreation was a solemn duty, not a form of entertainment to be painted on party supplies. A different and more provocative theory argues that the omission isn't about respect, but about a lack of interest. This school of thought suggests that for the Athenian man, the sexual act with his wife was so devoid of eros, so purely functional, that it simply wasn't a subject worthy of artistic representation. Art, especially the art of the Symposium cup, was about pleasure, desire, and excitement. Sex with one's wife was none of those things. It was a chore. You wouldn't paint a picture of yourself plowing a field on a party cup. And by the same token, you wouldn't paint a picture of the plowing of your wife for legitimate ears. In this view, the absence is not a sign of respect, but a sign of disdain, or at least, profound disinterest. A third perspective combines these, suggesting that the reason is that the vase paintings were primarily for the male gaze within the context of the Symposium. The imagery was designed to be aspirational, titillating, and celebratory of the world of male pleasure. The wife, as a figure of duty and domesticity, simply had no place in this visual landscape. She belonged to a different world, and so she was kept out of the picture. The debate continues, with historians trying to interpret the meaning of this very loud silence in the visual record. So as you recline at your symposium, you lift your calyx to your lips. As you drink, a painted scene on the inside bottom of the cup is revealed, perhaps a satyr chasing an imp, or an heiress destined his Euromenos. The pot in your hand is not just a cup. It's a piece of social programming. It's a reminder of the world of pleasure that exists for you, a visual celebration of the norms of your culture. And the images that are conspicuously not there tell you just as much as the ones that are. The pots are a user's manual for the Athenian man's world, with all its permissions and all its prohibitions, painted right there in black and red. Let's lift our gaze from the pottery on the table and look up, towards the heavens, to understand the attitudes on the ground in Athens. It helps to understand the behavior of the gods on Mount Olympus. For the ancient Greeks, mythology was not a collection of quaint bedtime stories. It was a living, breathing part of their culture, a divine drama that reflected, explained, and justified their own world. And when it came to their private lives, the gods were, to put it mildly, immersive. The central, unavoidable historical fact is that the Greek gods, particularly the king of them all, Zeus, provided a perfect divine model for the earthly male's double standard. Zeus was the husband of the goddess Hera. Their marriage was celestial, eternal, and the symbolic bedrock of order in the cosmos. Hera was the goddess of marriage and childbirth, the divine equivalent of the respectable Athenian wife, and she was also famously, perpetually, pathologically jealous, and for very good reason. Zeus was relentlessly unfaithful. His myths are, to a large extent, a catalogue of his affairs. He pursued and seduced or assaulted a staggering number of mortal women, nymphs, and even other goddesses. He did this by constantly changing his shape, He appeared as a swan to Leda, a shower of gold to Danae, a bull to Europa. He was the ultimate fool and error, using his power and his cunning to satisfy his desires, with little regard for the consent of his partners or the feelings of his wife. What's crucial is how this was perceived. While Zeus's actions caused chaos and often ended tragically for the women he pursued, his behavior was never presented as diminishing his authority or his status as king of the gods. He was powerful, and he acted on his desires. That was his nature. His wife here, on the other hand, was often portrayed as a nagging, vengeful shrew. Her rage was directed not at Zeus, whom she could not challenge, but at his lovers and their illegitimate children like the hero Heracles. The divine family, as presented in the myth, was a perfect mirror of the Athenian ideal, the powerful, promiscuous husband and the respectable, but ultimately powerless and resentful wife. Now for specific and telling detail that adds another layer to this, the myth of Ganymede. We mentioned it in passing, but it's worth a closer look. Ganymede was a beautiful Trojan prince, the most handsome of all mortals. Zeus, captivated by his beauty, transformed into an eagle, abducted the boy, and carried him up to Mount Olympus to be his personal cupbearer. The understanding in the classical world was that Ganymede was also Zeus's lover, his Eromenos. This myth was hugely important. It provided a divine precedent for pederasty. If the king of the gods himself took a male youth as his beloved, how could the practice be anything but honorable? The story of Zeus and Ganymede was depicted constantly in art and literature. It was the ultimate seal of approval from the highest possible authority, elevating the love of a man for a boy to the level of the gods. This divine modeling has led to a major debate among scholars of religion and mythology. Did the myths shape the society? Or did the society shape the myths? In other words, did the Greeks behave the way they did because their gods set the example, or did they create gods who behaved the way they did in order to justify their own existing social structures? One perspective, the top-down model, argues that mythology was a powerful prescriptive force for a deeply religious society. The actions of the gods provided a charter for human behavior. The stories of Zeus's affairs and his love for Ganymede effectively told the Greek man, this is natural. This is what powerful beings do. It is your right. In this view, the myths weren't just stories. They were a form of religious and social instruction, helping to normalize and validate the patriarchal double standard in the institution of pederasty. The other perspective, the bottom minus up or reflection team model, argues the opposite. It suggests that the myths are a projection of human society onto a divine screen. The Greeks didn't invent the double standard because Zeus had won. They imagined a Zeus who had a double standard because that was the reality of their own world. The pantheon of gods, with its squabbles, its affairs, and its power dynamics, is essentially the Athenian oikos household writ large. The myths, in this view, are not a cause of social norms, but a consequence of them. They are a way for a culture to explore, understand, and ultimately justify its own practices by giving them a timeless, divine setting. Most likely, the influence flowed both ways in a continuous feedback loop. The social realities of the Greeks informed the stories they told about their gods, and those divine stories, in turn, reinforced and legitimized those social realities for the next generation. It was a powerful, self-minus perpetuating system. So when you, as Damon, looked up at the frieze on a temple or listened to a poet recite a hymn, you saw your own world reflected in the divine one. Your freedom to seek pleasure outside your marriage, your wife's confinement, even the acceptable forms of desire. It all had a parallel on Mount Olympus. The behavior of the gods didn't just excuse your own, it sanctified it. It made the social structure of Athens feel not like a mere human invention, but part of the fundamental, eternal order of the cosmos. We've talked about the social structures, the laws, and the gods. Now let's get into something even more fundamental, the very biology of men and women. Or at least, biology as the Greeks understood it. Their medical and scientific ideas about the human body were, by our standards, wildly inaccurate and deeply strange. And these scientific facts provided yet another layer of justification for the social roles we've been exploring. The central historical point is that ancient Greek medical theory was thoroughly patriarchal. It wasn't just a neutral scientific inquiry. It was a system of thought that consistently defined the female body as an inferior, imperfect version of the male. The male body was the norm, the ideal, the standard of perfection. The female body was a deviation from that standard. The great philosopher Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers in Western history, famously wrote that a woman was essentially an infertile male or a mutilated male. He believed that in the act of conception, the man provided the form and the soul, while the woman merely provided the inert matter. This way of thinking saw men as hot and dry, which were considered active and superior qualities. Women, on the other hand, were cold and wet, passive and inferior qualities. This elemental belief had far minus-reaching consequences. Because women were colder, their bodies were thought to be incapable of cooking the semen into a perfect being, which is why they couldn't produce their own seed. Their role was purely passive and receptive. This scientific framework perfectly mirrored the social expectation for men to be active and dominant, and women to be passive and submissive. It wasn't just a social convention. It was biology. Now for a truly bizarre and specific medical belief about the female body, the wandering womb. Greek medical writers, including the famous Hippocrates, believed that a woman's uterus hysterea, from which we get the word hysteria, was not a fixed organ. They thought it was a separate, living creature inside the woman's body that could become light and dry and wander around her or so in search of moisture. If it wandered upwards, it could press against her diaphragm, causing symptoms like shortness of breath, anxiety, and fainting. This condition was known as hysterical suffocation. What was the prescribed cure for this wandering womb? There were two main approaches. The first was to use foul-smelling substances to drive the womb back down. A doctor might have the woman smell something unpleasant, like burning wool or sulfur. The second, and more common, prescription was marriage and pregnancy. The theory was that regular intercourse would water the womb, making it heavy and condense, so it would stay in its proper place. This medical theory is a stunning piece of social ideology dressed up as science. A woman's psychological or physical distress was not seen as a valid health issue in its own right, but as a symptom of her womb being unoccupied. The diagnosis was a wandering womb. The prescription was a husband. It perfectly reinforced the idea that a woman's natural and healthy state was to be married and bearing children. These kinds of medical beliefs have fueled a major scholarly debate. Was Greek medicine a genuine attempt at science? Or was it purely a to love social control, the traditional view, which long celebrated the Hippocratic school as the dawn of rational medicine, tends to see these bizarre ideas as honest mistakes. They argue that these early doctors were working without modern tools. They were doing their best to understand the body through observation and reason, and they simply got a lot of things wrong. The wandering womb theory, in this view, was a genuine, if flawed, attempt to explain real symptoms that they were observing in their female patients. However, a more critical, feminist perspective argues that you cannot separate Greek science from Greek social ideology. These scholars contend that the medical theories were not developed in a vacuum. They were constructed in a way that consistently supported the existing social hierarchy. The image of the woman as a defective male or the diagnosis of a wandering womb were not just innocent scientific errors. They were powerful tools for pathologizing female experience and reinforcing the idea that a woman's health and happiness were dependent on male control. They argue that the very questions the doctors were asking were shaped by their preconceived notions about female inferiority. It wasn't an unbiased search for truth. It was a search for evidence that confirmed what they already believed about the proper place of women. So, when you, Damon, looked at your wife, Lyra, you wouldn't just see a person. You would see a different kind of biological being, one defined by coldness, wetness, and a dangerously mobile internal organ. Your understanding of her health, her moods, and her very nature would be filtered through this lens of perceived inferiority. The social distance between men and women was not just built on laws and customs. It was carved into their very understanding of flesh and blood. The hierarchy of your society wasn't just a good idea. It was, according to your most learned men, a fact of nature. We've talked a lot about the unwritten rules, the social pressures, and the philosophical justifications. But what happened when things went wrong? What happened when these codes were violated? Let's turn to the law itself. Let's imagine we are in an Athenian courtroom, listening to a case. What you'll find is that the law, like everything else, was designed primarily to protect the interests, property, and honor of one person, the adult male citizen. The central historical point is that in Athenian law, many offenses that we would consider crimes against a person, especially a woman, were actually framed as crimes against property. The most potent example of this is the law on adultery, or moikiai, which we've touched on. Let's dissect it from a purely legal perspective. When a man had an affair with another man's wife, the injured party in the eyes of the law was not the wife. It was the husband. The crime was not seen as a betrayal of trust or an emotional wound against the woman, but as a violation of the husband's oikos, household, and his property. The seducer had trespassed on the husband's domain and, most critically, had potentially corrupted his bloodline by introducing the possibility of an illegitimate heir. The adulterer was committing a form of theft, stealing the man's lineage and his family's future. This is why the husband had the right to kill the man caught in the act. He wasn't just avenging a personal slight. He was defending his property and the integrity of his line, which was a matter of public interest. The woman, in this legal framework, was less a victim and more the damaged property through which the crime was committed. Now for a specific and fascinating legal detail that shows how this property minus-based logic worked: the distinction between assault, hubris, and seduction, moiki, i.e. when it came to a man's wife. You might think that a violent assault would be considered a more serious crime than a consensual affair. But in Athenian law, it was the other way around. Seduction was often treated as the graver offense. Why? The reasoning, as laid out by orators like Lucius, is chillingly logical from their perspective. A man who forced himself upon a woman had damaged her, but he had not necessarily corrupted her mind. He had violated her body, but not her loyalty to the oikos. But a man who seduced a wife was seen as far more dangerous. He had crept into the household, not with violence, but with persuasion. He had corrupted her will, turned her against her own husband, and made her a willing accomplice in the deception. She now had secret knowledge and a divided loyalty. She might poison her husband or help her lover steal from the house. She had become an enemy within the gates. The seducer hadn't just trespassed on the husband's property. He had stolen the guardian of the household herself. Therefore, the law came down harder on the smooth-minded stalking seducer than on the violent attacker, because the seducer posed a greater threat to the internal security and control of the husband's circles. This legal distinction has fueled a major historical debate. Was Athenian law designed to protect women? And all the traditional view might argue that, in its own way, it did, by placing the wife under the absolute protection of her husband Kyrios. The law shielded her from the outside world, the severe penalties for adultery, while punishing the woman, also acted as a powerful deterrent to men who might prey on her. In this view, the patriarchal structure of the law, while not granting women rights, did offer them a form of protection, like a valuable object locked securely in a safe. However, the overwhelming modern consensus, particularly among legal and feminist historians, is that the law was not designed to protect women as people, but to protect men's interest in women. They argue that women were legal objects, not legal subjects. They had no direct voice in court. They could not bring a case, file for divorce, or own property in their own right. They had to be represented by a male Kyrios, their father, husband, or closest male relative. The law's primary function was to regulate the orderly transfer of women and their dowries from one male guardian to another. Any protection they received was an incidental byproduct of protecting the husband's honor and property. The law didn't care if a woman was happy or safe, only that she was chaste and produced legitimate heirs for her husband. The debate is essentially between seeing the law as a flawed but functional system of protection, or as a finely tuned instrument of male control. So, as you sit on the wooden benches of the Athenian court, you realize that justice here has a very specific meaning. It's not about universal human rights or the protection of the vulnerable. It's about maintaining the established order. The law is the final backstop, the ultimate enforcer of all the social norms we've explored. It is the framework that holds the patriarchal, citizen-focused world together, ensuring that property, power, and women remain in their designated places. And so, here we are, at the end of our long walk through the streets and homes and minds of ancient Greece. We've seen the world through your eyes, Daemon, a world that is at once magnificent and deeply disturbing. It's a place of brilliant light and profound shadow, of soaring philosophical ideals and brutal, earthy realities. As we stand here for one final look, let's try to pull all these contradictory threads together. The ultimate, overarching point of our entire journey is this ancient Greek intimacy was not about love. It was about power. Every single relationship we've examined, between husband and wife, master and slave, man and boy, citizen and foreigner, was fundamentally structured by a rigid hierarchy of power. The defining question was never who do you love, but who are you allowed to dominate. The active-passive dichotomy was the grammatical rule underpinning every sentence spoken in the language of desire. Your role determined your honor, and your honor determined your worth as a human being. This was a world of stark, unapologetic contradictions. It was a society that produced breathtakingly beautiful art celebrating the human form, yet treated the bodies of women and slaves as mere property. It was a culture that invented democracy, the idea of rule by the people, yet systematically excluded the vast majority of its population from having any say. It was a place where the love between a man and a boy could be elevated in philosophy as the purest form of eros, while simultaneously being a potential minefield of exploitation and shame. They celebrated the mind, yet built a society on some of the most bizarre and misogynistic biological theories imaginable. Let's touch on one final, specific detail that encapsulates this paradox: the figure of Eros himself. In our modern imagination, Eros, or Cupid, is acute, chubby baby with a little bow and arrow. But in archaic and classical Greece, Eros was often depicted as a powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous god. He was a handsome and athletic youth, sometimes shown as a mischievous tormentor. To be struck by Eros's arrow was not a pleasant experience. It was a form of divine madness, an illness that robbed you of your reason and self-minus control. Saw a frozen knee. The Greeks were deeply suspicious of passionate love, even as they were fascinated by it. They recognized it as a force that could inspire greatness, but also as a chaotic power that could destroy reputations, households, and even cities, the Trojan War being the ultimate example. Their very god of love was a symbol of this contradiction, beautiful, desirable, and terrifying all at once. This brings us to our final academic debate, one that hangs over this entire subject. Can we, and should we, judge the ancient Greeks by our own moral standards? This is the classic problem of presentism versus historicism. One school of thought argues that we must try to understand the Greeks on their own terms. To label their practices as sexist, exploitative, or abusive is to impose our 21st century values on a culture that did not share them. These historians strive for a kind of scholarly detachment, seeking to explain the Greek system as a functional, coherent whole, without moral condemnation. They argue that our job is to understand, not to judge. The other school of thought pushes back, arguing that while we must understand the historical context, we should not suspend our moral faculties. They contend that power imbalances, exploitation, and the suffering of the voiceless are universal human issues, not cultural, specific quirks. To simply describe the system without acknowledging the immense human cost to the secluded wife, the powerless slave, the vulnerable youth, is to be complicit in sanitizing the past. These scholars believe it is not only possible, but necessary to call out the injustices of the past, not to feel superior, but to learn from them and to give a voice to those whom history has tried to silence. So where does that leave us? Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that ancient Greece was a grand, failed experiment in many ways. It was a society that reached for the stars in philosophy, art, and politics, but remained firmly anchored to the earth by its brutal hierarchies and its deep-seated prejudices. To study them is to feel a strange mix of admiration and revulsion. We are their cultural descendants in so many ways. Our politics, our language, our art are all deeply indebted to them. But we have also, thankfully, rejected some of their most fundamental assumptions about who gets to be a full human being. Your journey as Damon is over. You can step back out of his sandals and breathe air that is free from the constant, anxious pressure to perform your status. You can see the world again through your own eyes, in a time and place where the rules, for all their own flaws, are different. The world of ancient Greece remains behind. A fascinating, alien landscape. A powerful reminder that the things we take for granted about love, desire, and relationships are not timeless truths, but products of a specific time and a specific place. The dust of the agora settles. The faint light from the last oil lamps in the undrawn flickers and dies out. The rhythmic clack of the loom in the Guinea icon has long gone silent, leaving only the soft sound of breathing in the dark. The city of Athens is finally asleep, dreaming its own chaotic dreams of gods and glory, of honor and shame. And you can let go of it all now. Let the weight of Damon's world, with all its rigid rules and unspoken anxieties, just dissolve. Feel it drift away like smoke from a distant altar fire. You are no longer on those hard, sun-baked streets. You are floating, comfortably, in the quiet space between wakefulness and sleep. The journey is over. There are no more roles to play, no more judgments to fear. The gentle hum you hear is not the chatter of the marketplace, but just a soft, steady sound carrying you deeper into rest. The story is told, its sharp edges softened by the distance of time, its troubling questions now just echoes in a far-off ruin. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing left to understand. There is only the calm, steady rhythm of your own breath, a quiet anchor in the peaceful darkness. You can feel yourself drifting now, on a slow, silent river, moving towards the soft shores of your own dreams. Just let it carry you. Let it all go. The end of the article. Good night.